We're going to go ahead and get started with the next section. My name is Jack Reynolds, and the title of my presentation is How Free Market Principles Can Enable Commercial Space Development. This was the subject of my senior honors thesis, which I completed a couple of months ago. I'm actually a senior at Tarleton State University. I graduate in August with a BS in economics and a minor in math. I start business school in the fall at the University of Texas in Dallas. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because they only gave me 15 minutes. In the 1860s, the American government spent more than $500 million to create the Transcontinental Railroad. In one of the largest capital investment projects of the New Deal, the government spent almost $10 billion to bring electric power to rural areas. After World War II, the government spent more than $100 billion in education loans to returning veterans. A decade later, Congress authorized $200 billion for a national highway system. Between 1962 and 1972, the U.S. spent more than $250 billion and more than 3.5% of the combined national debts of that same period to achieve the ambitious goal of successfully landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. 25 years later, in his 1996 State of the Union address, President Clinton declared that the era of big government is over. In the mid-60s, when America's fledgling space agency was still in its infancy, trust in government was at 77%. At the time of President Clinton's declaration, public trust in government had sunk to a humbling 25%, only 8% off its all-time low just 2 years earlier. Today, as the national budget deficit swells under the weight of entitlement programs, vestiges of big government remain. Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and defense spending account for 75% of all national spending. So while the debate over the role and size of government rages on, it is clear that the era of big government-funded projects is over. Between 1972 and 1995, NASA's budget increased by an annual average rate of 0.4%. Since President Clinton's declaration, NASA's budget has decreased by an average annual rate of 0.2%. Contrast this with the explosive growth in NASA's budget between 1962 and 1972, which was almost 7%. Commercial space development is neither easy nor cheap, but it can no longer be funded by big government. Back when the nation's wealth was concentrated in a handful of American aristocrats, it made sense for the government to pick up the slack where the private sector simply wouldn't or couldn't fund projects themselves. While the government retains its fundamental role in funding basic research and codifying appropriate policy and legal regimes to support economic commerce, the fact of the matter is it is no longer necessary for the government to fund large space development projects. In the last 100 years or more, the American economy has diversified and given rise to a huge investment class. Globalization has helped replicate that investment class in countries all over the world. Private investment capital flows more freely now than at any other time in our history. During the dot-com boom of the late 90s, venture capital investment grew by an average annual rate of 43%. From $7.5 billion in 1995 to over $120 billion in 2000. NASA's entire budget that year was only $17 billion. The capital invested in 2000 was 3 times NASA's single largest budget of $40 billion in 1966, and all amounts are adjusted for inflation to 2010. During any comparable period of time since 1995, venture capital investment has exceeded NASA's combined $250 billion budget from 1962 to 1972 by more than $75 billion. A high-tech boom in the commercial space sector could fuel the next big surge in venture capital investment and drive our economy to ever greater heights. The cost of getting to space is largely regarded as the single greatest contributing factor to the high cost of commercial space operations. It is this high upfront cost that many believe makes commercial space ventures unlikely candidates for venture capital. High startup costs are often associated with lengthy returns on investment. In other words, the more it costs to start a venture, the longer it takes to show a profit and provide the return investors require. But high cost and long investment return times have never been a significant enough impediment to discourage capitalistic exploitation of undeveloped markets. One has to look no further than the oil or pharmaceutical industries to find just 2 examples of industries whose capitalization requirements and return times rival those, if not exceed, most modest space ventures. But both the oil and pharmaceutical industries have products with well-defined and growing markets. In the case of oil, every developed and developing nation is growing increasingly dependent upon the world's oil supply, despite associated geopolitical tensions. Likewise, the pharmacological needs of an exponentially growing population are, at least for the moment, likewise exponential, and drugs are needed to combat a number of ailments from AIDS to athlete's foot. The cost of large-scale drilling operations can vary widely with a number of variables, such as location. For example, researchers estimate that the total costs that producers would incur in extracting oil from the Alaska National Wildlife Reserve and the Outer Continental Shelf and bringing it to the market is around $28 a barrel. The large Persian Gulf OPEC producers, on the other hand, enjoy costs as low as $5 per barrel, while OPEC countries outside the Persian Gulf average costs of less than $9 per barrel. What is most immediately apparent from either estimated per barrel cost is the staggering operating margins at which oil producers operate. The current price of $80 per barrel of oil represents a 200% markup from the per barrel cost to potential ANWR/OCF producers, and a 1,500% markup from the per barrel cost to Persian Gulf OPEC nations. Even if oil falls back to $50 per barrel, that price still represents an 80% markup for ANWR/OCF producers and a 900% markup for Persian Gulf OPEC nations. The pharmaceutical industry also has high capitalization requirements. According to figures from the National Science Foundation and an industry trade association, in 2003, the pharmaceutical industry spent between $17 and $37 billion on research and development of innovative new drugs. By 2007, the pharmaceutical industry was spending as much as $60 billion on research and development. In 2000, it cost drug companies an estimated $802 million to develop a single new drug, which includes spending on failed drug projects. That same study found it took almost 12 years to bring a new drug to market. Some industry experts, however, place the price tag for discovering, developing, and launching a single new drug at more than double that previous estimate. Based on an analysis of a narrower, more recent time frame, total drug company spending is estimated to be close to $1.7 billion. Costs that high drive down the return on investment to 5%. A return that low translates to 1 out of every 6 new drug prospects delivering returns above their cost of capital. The current rate of return, by the way, is estimated to be around 4%. Despite the current model of drug development, in which research and development efforts are concentrated on drugs that can command sales in excess of $1 billion, the pharmaceutical industry remains one of the most profitable industries in the United States. In 2009, Fortune 500 ranked the pharmaceutical industry as the 3rd most profitable industry in the nation. The pharmaceutical industry continues to rank high in return on assets, 3rd, and return on shareholders' equity, 5th. It was also ranked as the 5th fastest growing industry based on one-year profit gains. Additionally, IMS Health, a private firm providing health industry market analysis, predicts that the global pharmaceutical market will grow by 4 to 6% in 2010, exceeding $825 billion. By 2013, the value of the global pharmaceutical market is estimated to be almost $1 trillion. While the industry struggles to find a path to sustainable returns, R&D expenditures show no signs of receding, and new biotech firms continue to proliferate. Despite the industry's twin problems of rising development costs and diminishing returns on investment, industry-wide profitability remains high, likely due to a low price elasticity of demand. In other words, the demand for drugs is relatively inelastic, which means that changes in price have a relatively small effect on the quantity of the drugs demanded. The oil industry is also relatively price inelastic, and there's a great deal of price volatility and risk, both financial and otherwise, involved in both drilling for oil and developing new drugs. This risk, coupled with the fact that it can take a decade or longer to see a substantial return on the upfront capital investment required, is reflected in the large operating margins both industries enjoy, as well as their price inelasticity. It seems likely that the early space development industry will confront similar issues with maintaining sustainable returns on investment. It is reasonable to conclude then that one way to enable commercial space development is to find a space product that is similarly inelastic and whose market supports the kind of price markup seen in the oil industry.